evening. Good morning. And sorry for the short notice. Okay. We'll start off with the first question on the sheet, which is about the Mezuzos in 770. I'll tell you how this came about. We were sitting and learning a mimer yesterday morning, and we're talking about it says in Poskim that when you sit in the sukkah, you have to have kavona. You have to have you have to think about the fact that the Eibishter took out the Yidden in the desert, and they were protected with the Anani HaKavod. Now, the kavona is part of the mitzvah. So Rabbi Wilhelm, who was teaching the Maimer, said that because really, how are you fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah? You're sitting in it, but you're passive. What are you doing? So he wanted to suggest that the kavona is the way you do mekayim the mitzvah, by having that kavona. Okay, fine. So the conversation went on. He suggested also that the mitzvah of mezuzah. You have a mezuzah. How do you fulfill the mitzvah of mezuzah? So he suggested that by the fact that you touch the mezuzah, because once you put up mezuzah, it's passive. It's just there. So he was suggesting by the fact that you touch the mezuzah, it's as if you're doing the mezuzah, so to speak. Because we know that if, for example, you put on tzitzis or talis early on, or before daybreak, or let's say you put on your tzitzis when you couldn't make a brocho. So then the halacha is that when you can make a brocho, you're mamashmish, you touch the tzitzis, and then you can make a brocho. For that matter, the tefillin. If you didn't make a brocha when you put on the tefillin for whatever reason, so then you are mamashmish, you touch the tefillin, and it's counted as if you've put on the tefillin now, so to speak. So he was suggesting that the touching of the mezuzah, he said he read it somewhere, which I haven't found the source yet for this, but the touching of the mezuzah, which is mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, it doesn't talk about kissing the mezuzah. There are more talks about touching the mezuzah. So he was suggesting that the touching of the mezuzah is a form of a pu'ula, of a deed that you're doing the mitzvah. All right. So taking that a little bit further, here's something very interesting, that the idea of putting a mezuzah inside a bamboo or something is mentioned in Poskim, might even be mentioned in the Zohar, I'm not sure. The idea of having it inside a kind of a pipe, but in 770, particularly in the Rebbe's room, you'll see that the mezuzahs are in plastic or paper covers. And what I'm suggesting is that if it would be a rigid mezuzah case, then when you touch it, you're not touching the mezuzah. And there is something about touching the mezuzah. There should be like a feeling, a sense that you're touching the mezuzah. So dafka, by having a soft cover to the mezuzah, of course, there's the other side of it, that when it's a soft cover, the mezuzah is not so protected from being squashed, etc. But on the other hand, there seems to be something about feeling the mezuzah when you touch it. And if that's the idea of like mamashmish, but tzitzis, mamashmish, tefillin, that might explain also why there is dafka a mile in having a soft cover for the mezuzah rather than a rigid, soft, hard cover. Let's move on. Okay. So the second question is, someone asked me earlier this week or last week, now we've got 2 weeks of shiur of shiurless here. For some reason, last Thursday night we didn't do a shiur. So the question was, does one need to use lechem mishneh for each meal on Yomtov? And the question is a practical one. You make a farbrengen at the end of Yomtov, whether it is Seuda or the end of Shabbos, end of haShono, the end of Simchas Torah. Is there a requirement of lechem mishneh at that point? That is the question. Okay, so now let's take a look at our list of our display. So first of all, is there a need for lechem mishnah on Yomtov? So, because the lechem mishnah is zecher for the fact that they didn't have mon. So here, this is from the Rif in the end of Psochim. So he writes, you're meant to be on Shabbos, you should be breaking bread on 2 loaves, and because it says Lokto Lechem Mishneh. And Pirshu Rabbon. Now the Rif adds that he's quoting from Seder of Amram Goen, that also Yom Tovim Nami, also on Yom Tov you need to break bread on 2 loaves, because the idea of Shabbos is because there was no mon which came down on Shabbos. They kind of had a double measure on Erev Shabbos. But Yom Tovim Nami lo have nochis. Actually, on Yom Tov also, the mon did not come down. It would come Erev Yom Tov a double measure. Just like you'd have a double measure on Erev Shabbos, so too there would be a double measure on Erev Yom Tov. And that's the basis of having, that's the last 2 lines, the Hilkach Be'inen Lemibser B'Yom Tov Al Tartin Rifoso Shelimoso, should have 2 whole loaves for Lechem Mishneh, just like for Pesach, for Shabbos. Then he goes on to Pesach, which is another parsha, 3 matzahs, 2 matzahs, etc. So that's the Shulchan Aruch. That's the Rif. Then we have here on the top of your screen, you see here from the Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Yomtov. Now I brought this from the Shulchan Aruch because the Alter Rebbe somehow does not have this. He has this siman, but this emphasis is not there in the Alter Rebbe. V'chayev levtzoya al shtei kikrois v'lekvoya al kol sud al yayin. That every meal of Yom Tov should have 2 loaves. Well, meanwhile, he said the meals of Yom Tov should have 2 loaves. So he's bringing down what the Rif has paskined, that Yom, it's not mefurish in Gemara, but this is how we learn, that Yom Tov also you have to have Lechem Mishneh. Question is, do you need to have, first of all, a Shalosh Seudos? People ask this question. Is there a requirement of Lechem Mishneh by Shalosh Seudos? So now, this is now from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. This is Reish Tzadik Aleph, where he says that b'shalosh seudos you should also make moitzi on 2 loaves, ashtei kikros shleimus, just like for the first 2 meals. And if you have several meals over Shabbos, more than 3, also you should have lechem mishneh at each meal on Shabbos. First opinion. V'yesh oimrim, there are those who disagree, and they say no, that Seuda Shlishis you can manage with 1 challah. You don't have to have 2. Why is that? Because on Friday came down the mon, which had 2 measures for each person. And for each measure, each oimer, they were able to produce 2 loaves. So that means the Friday delivery produced 4 loaves. 1 of them was eaten on Friday. And then they had Friday night. And then they had 1 on Shabbos morning. So now you started off with 4, and now you're left with 1. Therefore, for Seuda Shlishis, you don't need to have 2 loaves. You only have to have 1. So this again, the first opinion says Shalosh Seudos, you should have 2 loaves, because the idea of Lechem Mishneh should be celebrated at every meal. The second opinion says no, the Shalosh Seudos, you don't need to have 2 challahs. Indeed, the minhag has been to take the lenient view that by Shalosh Seudos to rely on having 1 loaf. He says, really, the main halacha is like the first approach, that you should have lechem mishneh by Shalosh Seudos also. Unless you don't have, okay, then you shouldn't have less than 1. Okay, fine. All right, so Shalosh Seudos on Shabbos, it's recommended to have lechem mishneh. And what we're saying here is similarly. So now let's come back now on Yomtov. There's no chiyuv of a Seuda Shlishis on Yomtov. But the question then is, it's totally voluntary. Is there a inyan of having lechem mishneh? So now, looking, this is now from the Shmir Shabbos Kelchoso. So he writes, mitzvah levtzoya v'chol Seuda shel Shabbos v'shel Yomtov al shnei lochomim shleimim. Just the same logic that there is to have 2 loaves for every meal on Shabbos, the same logic applies to Yomtov. And then he says later in the notes, whatever he says, it's of course bedashas adchak you can manage with 1, but really 1 should read. when I actually, at the beginning of the week or last week, when the person asked me this question, I hadn't done my homework. This is the shiur drives me to do a bit more homework. But meanwhile, I told him, we all remember very vividly by the Rebbe, but it was the Seuda at the end of Yomtov, and with Rosh Hashanah, and the Rebbe would hold these two big challahs, two round challahs, and he would hold them, they were facing back to back, and he would make hamotzi, he would cut, I remember holding the two challahs like this, back to back, and with a knife, like a swinging motion over the two challahs, and then he made a motzi on one of the, he broke off a piece of challah from one of the challahs, so he was Beitzea, that was obviously the third Seuda for Yomtov, and still he was made on lechem mishnah, so it's recommended. So this is the question, back to the question. You're making a farbrengen for the end of Yomtov. Should you encourage lechem mishnah? You should. Yeah, it's not a big deal because unless you're very, very worried about COVID, you can have one person takes the other one's challah, puts it together, and you can manage to have lechem mishnah. Okay, so that's the question 2 we've dealt with. Let's go on to the question 3. This was, I think it was Shabbos Shuvah, was recently one of the neighbors knocked on. So what's a Shabbos? It was an hour after Shabbos. And he said, for some reason, that at Havdalah, they had made the brocho, the person making Havdalah said the hamavdil, had forgotten to say Be'er Priagofen. And then he said Be'er Priagofen after hamavdil. So does he have to repeat Havdalah or you Yotze? So here's actually quite an interesting chiddush here. That the Alter Rebbe. Now we have the Alter Rebbe at the top of your page is in Hilchos Pesach, where we have the Seuda. He talks about the Seuda of Yaknahaz by Kiddush. First the Priagofen, and then you say the brocho Mekadesh Yisrael v'Azmanim, and then the brocho on the flame, and then you make the brocho Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'Kodesh, and then Shechionu. So we know the Yaknahaz. Then the Alter Rebbe adds in brackets. Now, what is a style of the Alter Rebbe with the brackets? There is a story that the Alter Rebbe wrote things in brackets. He wanted to review them at a later stage. That is also true, but it seems to be also when the Alter Rebbe came up with his own chiddush. So he would often put those chidushim in a bracket. So ve'im shino haseder shehikre mamucher va'echer hamukdam. If he switched the seder of the Yaknahaz, it's Yotze or Yotze. You don't have to do a Kiddush again. Unless Hiktim HaKiddush LeBirchas HaYayin. If you made first Mekadesh Yisrael V'Azmanim and then Hagofen, then he says you have to make Kiddush all over again. Because this is a Machlokas B'S Shammai B'S Hillel. B'S Shammai say you have to first say the brocho Mekadesh HaShabbos and then Hagofen, because it's the Kiddush which kind of invited, the reason why you have the wine is because of the Kiddush, the first of the Kiddush. And B'S Hillel will say, no, you have to first make the brocha on the wine, and then you make the brocha Mekadesh HaShabbos. Now, if you follow B'S Shammai against B'S Hillel, you're not Yotze. Says the Alter Rebbe, if a person made Kiddush, and he first said HaMekadesh HaShabbos, Mekadesh Yisrael V'Azmanim, and then said Be'er Priagofen, he has to do Kiddush again. So then this is that was like raised an alarm bell in my mind that this boy who came around to the door on Moshe Shabbos 2 weeks ago, if she's not Yotze, the same thing that you meant to make first Hagofen and then the brocho Hamavdil. And that's what my mind is there a difference between Havdalah and Kiddush? Alter Rebbe's Kiddush is about Kiddush, not about Havdalah. B'S Shammai talk about Kiddush, don't talk about Havdalah. So I was mulling about this, and I felt that I told him not to make Havdalah again. Afterwards, I looked into it a bit further. One of the prominent Gaonim in Poland, going back about 100 years ago, his name was Reb Meir Arik. And as a Chassid, I don't know of which Rebbe, Sich Stark in Alter Rebbe. And Reb Meir Arik, in his notes in the Sefer Minchas Pittim, he asks a question. How can the Alter Rebbe say that you first make Mekadesh HaShabbos and then By pre-Gofen, you're not Yoitze. Take a look in the Shulchan Aruch in the Kiddush, which you have the bottom of your page. It says Kiddush halakois. If you made Kiddush on a cup of wine, normal Kiddush, and then by mistake you slipped up and you start talking about unrelated topics. Hifsik bedibur. You start talking about who won, Chelsea or Arsenal. You start talking about Jimmy Greaves, all of us. So now, so Hifsik bedibur. You have to make it hagofen again, and we don't make Kiddush again. So he's made Kiddush hagofen, and then he made the Mekadosh Shabbos. But then he said hagofen afterwards. So he's doing like Bishamai. So how is it Yotze? So the Rebbe Arik asks this question: how can the Alter Rebbe say if you switch the order, you're not Yotze? Here you see that you are Yotze. That's the Rebbe Arik's question. And the simple answer is, which later I think the Tilla David, I don't remember exactly who, others respond to that question. The following: when the Alter Rebbe says you're not Yoitze, means if a fellow wants to be an overhang, I don't know how you say overhang in English. A fellow wants to be a smart aleck, and he says, I'm going to do Kiddush and then hagofen. So any other tricks which you'll do, you're Yoitze b'diavad. But you want to be this trick you're doing consciously in the wrong order. You're doing like Bishama, you're not Yoitze. The Alter Rebbe, where he talks about the fellow forgot, it wasn't he's trying to do it. I mean, Bishama, he doesn't even know about Bishama. He slipped up. He spoke about the Jimmy Greaves. It was Wilster. He's not thinking about Bishama. Good. So then he is Yoitze. And so coming back to our story, the fellow who made Havdalah and slipped up, he's not thinking about Bishama. He made a mistake. He's just a little bit confused, and he made a mistake. He's not trying to follow Bishama. There, the Alter Rebbe wasn't talking about this. When the Alter Rebbe says Shino Haseder, means he consciously made a change, then we say you're passing wrong. You have to do it again. In the case of a person who slipped up, made a mistake, then you don't have to repeat Kiddush, don't have to repeat Havdalah. Let me now look at one of the notes. Where you do need two challahs but forgot, can you use a frozen challah for the second one? And the answer is yes. It doesn't take long for them to defrost, and you're not mechuyev to eat both. So yes, you can use a frozen challah. There is an interesting question whether you can use an Erev Pesach shulchan be as a Shabbos, whether you're allowed to use a matzah wrapped in a plastic bag together with a challah. I mean, I wouldn't dream of doing that, but the question has been addressed. All right, let's move on. Another question which came through this week. Someone asks, oops, I'm sorry, I tried to cover the number of the door and the artwork moved over. Doesn't matter. There's a house and they've got this overhang, as you can see. And as you look towards the bottom, next to the stairs, there are some plant pots. And the question was, would they be allowed to consider under the overhang to be considered a Rishus HaYochid, to be able to take a key hidden under the plant pot and use it to open the door? As you can see, the front wall of this property is quite low, so it doesn't make it, it's not 10 tefachim high. So then the question was, could we take that overhang and consider that as a wall? Now we have the term which we have for this is pi tikro yored v'soisim, that the edge of the ceiling kind of creates a vertical. You've got a horizontal ceiling, and the edge of that horizontal ceiling will be considered to be creating a vertical barrier. So the idea was that as if you're going to have a vertical barrier coming down along the length of this this overhang, and also over here, the width, and that would create that plant pot would be inside the Rishus HaYochid, and you'd be allowed to carry from one to the other. So now here we have, this is from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in the dinim of Eruv, etc. Shin Samach Aleph, and he talks here about a breach in a corner of a property, And then he says, what about a house, which there's a breach at the corner? There's the wall that has come down at the corner. And there's a diagonal opening to this house. So he says you won't use you don't use the principle of pitikra yorev v'sosim. And he adds another explanation, which was news to me actually, that the logic of pitikra yorev v'sosim is mishum shedoime lepesach. When you've got three sides, and the fourth side there's the end of a ceiling, and so we're going to look at it as if it was a doorway, and there's a door. The Karen's office, and this is a kind of principle in Halocho, it's not derech to make a pesach to a property in the corner. Meanwhile, what he's saying is that pitikra can only be in the middle of the wall, but not at a corner. Aval pesach she'ein b'Karen's office, if it would be just a single break, you could use the principle of pitikra. The edge of the ceiling would be creating a barrier. The second opinion says, Yesh oimrim afilu hi b'melua, and even if it's two of them, you could do your pitikra yored v'sosim, and if you've got two walls together as an L, which are there, and then you've got another two walls which are missing, and there's a ceiling over there, you would be able to, in the second opinion, you could do pitikra yored v'sosim, but not when you've got two parallel walls, like a carport idea. So then we've got these two opinions, and the conclusion is that actually that you could do pitikra yored v'sosim as in our instance. However, he finishes off, that's the last line, it's better to take heed of the first opinion, that you can't do a pitikra yored v'sosim. So coming back to our overhang or awning, whatever you want to call it, can you use the principle of pitikra yored v'sosim? If it's diagonal, if it's slanting, for sure you cannot. That's discussed earlier or later in the same siman. If it's flat, so the ikar hadin you can do, but it's recommended not to rely on that. Now let's finish off then. What I did say to the questioner is, if you hide your key under something which isn't muksa, a plant pot may very well be muksa. If you hide your key, you are able to move it within Dal Damas in the front garden, and then bring it to the door, push the door, it's an important point here. Many people have doors which open onto a place where there's no Erev, like in a block of flats, let's say, or a door, like say on the side of a shop, which is open mamash onto the street. You're outside the door, you're in the street. You cannot put the key in and push the door in, because then you will have taken the key from the street and put it into the Rosh Hashanah. So if you have such a door which is mamash onto the street, so the way to do it is you put the key in and you push the door just an inch, 2 inches, just beyond the door jamb. You withdraw the key and put it back on yourself or where you're hiding it, and then you go in. But you don't push the door in all the way in with the key in it, because effectively you've been taking the key from Rosh Hashanah or into the Rosh Hashanah. Let's move on. Okay, so here I was asked the following question, going back a little bit before Rosh Hashanah, and the fellow is Chassidish Geman, and he is the Baal Tokeiah, and so he's pastor. Baal Tokeiah should be, it says it should be the most tzaddik person seen as a tzaddik in that environment. All right, so he's a Chassidish Geman. It turns out that he davens slower, and so the gabe who will bang on the bimah or whatever to announce, because we blow shofar in the quiet Shemona Esrei, the gabe will bang on the table, and he has to blow, but he's not up to that. So can he blow shofar in the quiet Shemona Esrei when he's not up to that? So it's interesting, which I wasn't aware. As you know, there's this difference between Ashkenaz and Sfard. It's more a minhag Sfard to blow in the quiet Shemona Esrei. So in this Matei Ephraim, that's the lower quote, He says, B'chol Medina Seilu, generally the Ashkenaz minhag is not to blow in the quiet Shemona Esrei. Then he says, Yechidei Skula, third line here, second line, Noi hagin shehashliach tzibur k'shemagia l'simcha siyam birchas malkiyos Tokeiah tashrat shatarat. So it was news to me. He's suggesting that it's actually the chazan who blows the shofar in the quiet Shemona Esrei, which is not the experience I've had. Being around, it was in 770 also. It wasn't the chazan who blew in the quiet Shemona Esrei. So if it would be the chazan blowing in the quiet Shemona Esrei, we wouldn't have this question, because he's running the show. But the minhag which in Chabad is that you have Baal Tokeiah and you have a chazan and a gabe, and so the gabe will bang on the table. So now the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch talks about the blowing in the shofar during Shemona Esrei, and it says about the chazan whether he can blow the Shemona Esrei. He says really he shouldn't be blowing because it's confusing. Here is because he might be able to not be able to retrace where he's holding in davening. Then third line over here on the top of the page, Avalim who moved to if the chazan feels confident that he will be able to resume the davening without being too confused, or he's davening from a Seuda. Yeah, so we have it very easy. We all have Sidurim, Baruch Hashem. Those days, the chazan knew it Baal Peh. If the chazan is confident he'll be able to resume the davening after blowing shofar in the Shemona Esrei, he's allowed to. And he explains, Tkiya, blowing shofar, is not a hefsek at all. The way I understand it is, it's not speaking. It's not as if you're talking about any other topic. Blowing shofar is not speaking. It's a different type of activity. I don't know, if you wipe your forehead, that's not called a hefsek. It may not be appropriate to do gestures, but it's not a interruption. And therefore, I was inclined to say on this basis that this Ingerman is able to blow shofar, even though he's not up to the gap between one brocho and the next. He should be allowed to blow shofar in the quiet Shemona Esrei. Although I'm not totally confident with it, but that seems to be the halacha. Let's move on to the next question. So here, as I noticed something very interesting. At the end of Selichos, on a Tanis Tzibur, we have this Rachmana, and the same thing we have it at the end of Selichos, Yom Kippur by night. But on the Selichos up to Rosh Hashanah, we don't have the Rachamona De'one. And I was just curious, why is it there and not there? And so now, this Rosh Hashanah, I bought myself a new machzer, which has got various pirushim, and it sent me to this, on the Rachamona De'one, it had a note to this following tshuva written by the Ben Ish Chai. It's Tshuvas Torah Lishmo. He's got two Sfarim of Tshuvas, at least two. One is called Rav Piolim, and then the other one is called Torah Lishmo. He actually signs his name curiously as Yechezkel Kachali. And apparently Yechezkel Kachali somehow is the same gematria as Yosef Chaim. Be that as it may, this is the Sefer Torah Lishmo. And he deals with the fact that tefillah, generally, we don't daven in Aramaic. And the reason is, it says in the Gemara, that one shouldn't daven, a person shouldn't plead for his needs in Aramaic, because the Malochim, the angels, will not process, they will not elevate your tefillah, because they don't recognize Aramaic. There's deeper explanations in this, that the Aramaic is like an achirayim for Lashon HaKodesh. He discusses this at length. I'll just take one little piece. And so how here you say it's okay to daven in Aramaic, and here you say you shouldn't daven in Aramaic. Well, answers Leikash is not a problem. A Yochid shouldn't daven in Aramaic. A Tzibur can daven, because why is that? You have the expression Hein Keil Kabir Lo Yimos. The Eibishter will not despise the kabir, the rabbim, tfilos harabim. So the tfilos harabim is powerful, and they doesn't need to have the malachim to elevate it. The Eibishter will accept it even though it's in Aramaic. So that's why we have, like Moshe Kaddish, for example, is in Aramaic. And this is also discussed here in this tshuva. And but just, I want to read this last few lines. It says the Ben Ish Chai, now you'll understand that in Selichos has been established a few bakoshes in Aramaic. The Selichos were established to be daven to the tzibur, and to emphasize in the tzibur have got the koyach, a great power of kel kabel yimos, that they don't need to have the malachim. Therefore, the dafka put into the Selichos, they put a piece in Aramaic to bolster the understanding of a tzibur, the koyach tzibur, that even Aramaic can also be elevated. So it's as if there is kind of a sample. There's a certain little piece of the Selichos, bedafka put in Aramaic, to show that the tzibur can manage in Aramaic, tefillos can be accepted in Aramaic. So what I've noticed is that you've got in the Selichos, as I said, Yom Kippur or the Atanas tzibur, you've got rachmana de'ona. In the Selichos before Rosh Hashanah, we also have a couple of sections in Aramaic. I've got the bottom of the page, Yemache Omase and Moron de Vishmayo, these three pieces in Aramaic. And it's, according to the Ben Ish Chai, it's the same, it's coming with the same message, that we're davening as a tzibur, and it's okay for us to do it in Aramaic, to do part of it in Aramaic, because the Eibishter will accept it regardless. That's what he's saying. So here it's one piece of Aramaic. Also, I still don't have an answer why this piece was put into these Selichos and that piece was put in those Selichos. All right, that's perhaps by sharing it with the tzibur who are listening now or later, perhaps we'll get an answer on that also. All right, let's move on. Okay, last night, Motzei Yomtov, a brocho comes over to me and he says, I forgot to say Yalav Yovoi in Ritzei. So I continued, I was in the middle of Moedim, and I put in Yalav Yovoi where we'd say Alanissim. And then I finished, and then continued. I'll call these both the same now. Say I finished Moedim, I finished Esther. So he asks me, was he Yotze or not? So we know that the Ma'ariv, if you forget Yalav Yov and Ma'ariv Rosh Chodesh, you don't have to repeat Shemona Esrei. But if you forget Yalav Yov and Ma'ariv on Chol HaMoed, you do have to repeat Shemona Esrei. So now he remembered to say Yalav Yov, but he put it in the wrong place. Is he Yotze or not? Now, I actually did not find this addressed in Malaktim. I mentioned this before. I've got this 2-volume set of Shiyos Miyovin about all different mistakes which you can make in davening, and apparently there's more mistakes than he's listed. So we've got a new mistake. So are you Yotze or not? And I told him, if you're not Yotze, you have to do it again. So here we have in the Dinim of Rosh Chodesh, where it says, if you didn't say Yalav Yovei where you should, if you realize before Moedim, you put it right there. In other words, you said, oops, is not hefsek. So then you say, Yalav Yovei. And then you say Moedim. You can, in other words, you'll insert Yalav Yovoi after Machzis Shenosim L'Tzion before Moedim. That would be acceptable because you haven't gone and started the next one. But if you've already started Moedim, so then if he's already started Moedim, he has to go back to Ritzei and say insert it in Ritzei. If he didn't, then he has to go back to the beginning. So here I have a clear psak halacha. If you didn't say Yalav Yovei in the right place, you have the option of going back to Ritzei, but you don't have the option of inserting it at any other spot later. And therefore he missed the opportunity of going back. Therefore he to Ritzei, therefore he has to go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. That's what I told him. Again, as I said, I didn't see this in any Sforim. I looked for it, I didn't find it. Okay. Question. Fellow asks me, this is last week, his neighbor has got an apple tree, and the branches, part of some of the branches are overhanging to my garden, he says. What's about the fruit? Who do they belong to? So here we have, this is a Chush Mishpat, Siman Kuf, Samar Zayin, where you have a tree. If the tree is mamish on the border between two properties, so then the fruit are shared equally. Then there are mo'ads. If the tree is fully in the field of the one, and it's overhanging to the other one's field, so really the fruit of the overhanging tree belong to the owner of the tree. So that's the halacha. The situation was a little bit more complicated because the neighbor had no way of coming into the questioner's garden. Plus, the neighbor I told him, go and ask the neighbor. He said he looks like he's gone away for a couple of weeks. So I said, if that's the case, so then he has been mafkir, as far as has no interest in those fruit. And if you're going to leave them, they're just going to go rotten. So I felt in that case, if it's been mafkir them, and they're going to go to ruin in any case, I felt you could use them. And when he comes back, you'll tell him, and if he wants to be paid for them, you'll pay. Okay, let's move on. This is another question someone asked me this past week. Before we go into this one, we had a question 9 on your sheet. Is, may a tenant take schach from the trees growing on his rented premises? So I'm renting a property and I don't own the property, I don't own the trees. The trees are growing and they have schach. Am I allowed to cut branches of those trees to cover and use them for my sukkah? And I felt that actually, although again I didn't find this in any sources, I felt that you as a tenant actually should be looking after the property and you should be maintaining the property. So if you're going to cut branches in a way which you're going to ruin the tree, then you're wrong in doing so, and that would be a question of gzela also possibly. But if you are cutting the trees in a responsible way, and it's a form of proper maintenance of the property, so then on the contrary, you're doing the responsible thing, and therefore you should be allowed to use the schach, you use as schach for your sukkah. Which brings me to another question which I got from some shliach in Eastern Europe. He asked me the question, I'm a little bit hesitant to share it, but I'll tell you in any case, and if I got it wrong, so, can he pull off arovas off a tree in public property? So at first I said, ask if you get permissions, no problem. But the bureaucracy to go and find the official, and this one was saying to this one, to that one, to find it. So I said to him, I understood he was short of arovas. I said to him, you know what? If Reuven will pluck arovas and Shimon will use them, and Shimon will pluck arovas and Reuven will use them, because there is a idea of if you're going to say there's an element of gezela here, and therefore it's not good for the mitzvah. All right, so then if it's a gezel and shinui reshus, it's gone to someone else's property, then it takes away the mitzvah of hashova, and you'd be yotze with the. So really, I was feeling that it's not such a big issue in any case in the first place, because I don't think the authorities would have a problem with you ripping up a couple of leaves off their trees. But if there would be a chashash, so you'd be able to address this by switching over one to the other. Let's come to our next question, though. Also, a shliach in somewhere in Eastern Europe asked me, what is the story if someone is a chiyuv, is in his year of Avelis Rachmana litzlan, and he's running late? The tzibur are holding now B'Yoleinu, it's the last Kaddish, and he is in the middle of saying Psukei de Zimra. So is a chiyuv to say Kaddish, is he allowed to interrupt the middle of Psukei de Zimra to say Kaddish? That is the question. So what we have in front of you is from the Piskei Teshuvos, where he quotes the Chidah in the Sefer Kesher Goydel, who says that you are allowed to say, he's talking about the Kaddish from before Hoidu. And then he says, Yosem, within the 11 months of Avelos of our father or mother, and he came late, and now he's middle of Sukkot Zimra, so he is allowed to say the Kadeshim at the end of the davening, if he knows that he won't have an opportunity later to say those Kadeshim. Even if there are others who are saying Kaddish, but he is allowed to address his chiyuv. He's allowed to interrupt. And the general idea of answering various things in Sukkot Zimra and Krishma, Birchas Krishma, is based upon the idea of Mepnei Hayira, Mepnei HaKoved, which we all know the Mishnah in Brochos, that you are allowed to interrupt, to respond, Mepnei Hayira, Mepnei HaKoved. And so here he has a chiyuv, and he's allowed to address that chiyuv by in the middle of Sukkot Zimra. I'm not talking about Birchas Krishma, but Sukkot Zimra is more lenient, so he is allowed to. That's what the poskim say. So now, obviously, will come to mind, there's a letter of the Rebbe about this. And that is in Chelik Zayin of Igris. It's also in Shulchan Menachem, a well-known letter. The letter is addressed to the late Rabbi Yitzchok Dubov, who he lived in Manchester, and he was a mashgiach in Manchester Yeshiva. Rabbi Segal, Rabbi Yosef was the Rosh Yeshiva, and Rabbi Dubov was a mashgiach, and on the quiet, he was mekarev many Eden, Tanya, many Eden became Chassidim and Chabad Chassidim through his influence. Meanwhile, as the mashgiach, he asked the Rebbe, there's a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe printed in Sefer HaMamorim Tovshin Tes, where the Frierdiker Rebbe talks very strongly about the Kaddish D'Rabbanon before Hoidu. It looks like it was being neglected, and he promotes the importance of saying the Kaddish before Hoidu. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yitzchok Dubov davened ba'arichas, he davened slowly. The Bocherim's minyan was probably faster than him. So he had the following question. He would start davening earlier than the minyan, and when the minyan was, let's say, start 10 minutes earlier. And so then when the minyan came up to the, Rabbi Shmuel with the Kaddish, he was already after Baruch She'omar. And he was asking whether he's allowed to say the Kaddish D'Rabbanon before Hoidu when he is already ahead of the minyan in Sukkot Zimra. To which the Rebbe answers, Hine Ladaiti, I think from Tovshin Yud Gimel. In my opinion, I don't have the time to research this, but it's also, I think it's simple. That's the saying of the Kaddish D'Rabbanon is not your personal duty. It's a mutal ala minyan. It's the minyan. Someone of the minyan should be saying the Kaddish. But it's not a personal chiyuv. Therefore, you shouldn't be interrupting your Sukkot Zimra to say the Kaddish because it's not a personal chiyuv. Which from this itself, I see that's not a contradiction at all. Because there he's talking about volunteering to say Kaddish Rabbanon, which could be said by anyone. Here, our question is about a Kaddish, which for a Yosem Rachmana is a chiyuv to say Kaddish. So then it is his chiyuv. And therefore, it's two different stories. If it's a chiyuv, a personal chiyuv to say Kaddish, and he's in the middle of Sukkot Zimra, he could. If it's just to cover a communal need, then it shouldn't be him. It should be done by someone else. Okay. Again, someone asked me, it's a bit late to talk about it now, but it was before Sukkos. What's the story about a child under bar mitzvah? What do you do about arba minim? So, of course, the ideal would be to buy them their own set, but if for whatever reason that's not available, so let's take a look in the Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch. This is in Tafresh Nun Ches. It says, Lo yitnenu b'yom rishon lekoton koydem sheyetze by. Don't give the esrog, lulav, the same thing, to a child before you have done the mitzvah. Because the cotton will acquire, he won't be able to release it back to you. So he gives it back to you, it's not given back to you. So if you give a child your arba minim on the first day, it should be lochem. So it has to be yours, so we can't get it, he can't give it back to you. You can't fulfill the mitzvah after the child has used it. Some say when the child is of a certain age, it could be about 7 or 8 or something, where they have a little bit more of an understanding of buying and selling. Some say that is acceptable. Then he adds, "V'im toifus im hatinoik, kiven shele miyodo shaperdon." If you give the child the lulav and esrog, but you hold on to it also, you don't release it. You put it in the child's hand, but you also are holding it. Then that's okay. Then the child hasn't been koine. Kinyan means a show of ownership. And on the contrary, if you are holding on to it, you haven't released it. So you're not giving them the ownership. All right. So that's what it's just in the Mechaber writes in the Shulchan Aruch. So now we have the Mishnah Berurah Sifkot and Chavches. He says like this. All right. So by the fact that you hold on to it, the child isn't koine. Therefore, you're okay. Then he adds in the 5th line, Elo de b'chol elu. The fact that you hold on to the esrog and the lulav, you have covered that you have retained ownership, but the child has not been yotze because it's not shaloi, it's not called lochem, and so the father also hasn't done the mitzvah of chinuch to give the child the esrog and lulav, which is his own. So you've saved your own interest, or for other adults, but meanwhile you've deprived the child and of the mitzvah on the first day, and you've deprived yourself of the mitzvah of chinuch. Then he adds, "V'yesh me'achronish hasoivrim, the mitzvah is chinuch miskayin gam b'shol." Others say no, chinuch can be fulfilled even if the child doesn't own the esrog. I know when he's an adult, he'll have to own the esrog, but you can be, and on the level of chinuch, it can be with a borrowed esrog. Because even with a borrowed esrog, you're also training the child to do the mitzvah. I must say that I'm sure, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, where there's such a shortage of arba minim, I'm sure this is what they were doing. That they wouldn't release it to the child, and they would rely on these opinions. So as I said, of course, the better option would be to have a separate set for the children, which is Baruch Hashem now widely available. But if not, you hold on to it with the child, and you don't release it, and you go to the chinuch with that way. You see that Rishonim hold that way. All right. Finally, last 2 weeks ago, we had the discussion about the Hayom Tamtzenu, and I was worried about the sequence of the Aleph base. Tamtzenu, Tvorchenu, to Gadlenu, to Dershenu, and then it says Tishma Shavosenu, then to Kabel Barachimim, and then to Tismechenu. So it's Shin, Kuf, Tov. And I was concerned about the sequence there. So I've mentioned numerous times, Rabbi Zirkin, he wrote to me a very simple thing. Hayom Tishma, Hayom Tekabel. First day you ask the Eibishter to hear our prayer, our cry, and then you say, you heard it, then you should accept it. You can't say Hayom Tekabel and then Hayom Tishma. It doesn't make sense. But you can't accept it before you've heard it, so to speak. So it's just on a very simplistic level. That's why Tishma comes before Tekabel. I'm still not totally happy because you can find other words in the Aleph base that have the Shin after the Kuf. But on the level of Pshat, I think it's quite a good answer. Okay, I'm going to stop with this, and after Shabbos Bereshis, we're going to go back to Motzei Shabbos, Bez Hashem, and we'll do it at 8:30. And if we later on, we'll bring it a little bit earlier. That's if people ask for it a bit earlier. But meanwhile, this is I think manageable. I think Shabbos goes out about an hour earlier, so we should be able to manage it. And if you're listening to this year whilst you're helping to as Rabbi Luke calls it, television and television, so be it. Okay, seid alle gesund, a guten Moed, and a good Shabbos, and a guten Yomtov, and we should be in good health. Kol tov.